I asked an AI chatbot what the Ethiopian Bible says about Jesus' resurrection, and then, instead of just taking the answer at face value, I spent the next several hours actually fact-checking everything it told me against real historical and biblical scholarship. That turned out to be the right call, because some of what came back was genuinely accurate and fascinating, and some of it needed real correction. Here's exactly what held up, what didn't, and what the actual well-documented truth about Ethiopia's unique biblical tradition turns out to be. Claim 1. The Ethiopian Bible contains an entirely different account of Jesus' resurrection than the rest of Christianity. This is the claim that most viral videos on this exact topic lean on hardest, and it's also the one that falls apart fastest under any real scrutiny. The four Gospels recognized by the Ethiopian Orthodox, Tewahedo Church, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are the same four Gospels recognized by every major Christian tradition worldwide, telling the same core resurrection narrative: the empty tomb, the appearances to the disciples, the ascension. There's no alternate, secret resurrection story hiding inside Ethiopia's canonical Gospels, waiting to be uncovered. What's actually different about the Ethiopian biblical tradition isn't a rewritten core narrative. It's the much larger collection of additional books surrounding that core narrative, books the rest of Christianity either lost, debated, or formally excluded over the centuries, while Ethiopia simply kept them. Claim 2. The Ethiopian Bible has 81 books. This one checks out, and it's genuinely worth understanding why. Where the Protestant biblical canon contains 66 books, and the Catholic canon contains 73, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church's broader canon totals 81, generally counted as 46 Old Testament books and 35 New Testament books, though the exact count and categorization has varied somewhat across different historical lists and commentaries within the Ethiopian tradition itself. This gap exists because Ethiopia's Christian church, established in the 4th century following the conversion of King Ezana of the Aksumite Empire, developed its biblical canon largely independent of the centuries of doctrinal debate happening in Rome and Constantinople that eventually shaped the narrower Western canon most people are familiar with today. Around 480 CE, a group of monks remembered as the Nine Saints translated a complete Bible into Ge'ez, Ethiopia's ancient liturgical language, in one of the earliest full Bible translations completed anywhere in the world. Once that translation existed, Ethiopian Christianity simply kept transmitting it, largely unchanged, while Western Christianity continued actively narrowing and debating its own canon for the next several hundred years. Claim 3. The Ethiopian Bible includes the Book of Enoch, an ancient text that disappeared everywhere else. This claim is not only accurate, it actually understates how genuinely remarkable this particular piece of preservation really is. The Book of Enoch, specifically the text scholars call Warren Enoch, was clearly circulating among first-century Jewish communities, exactly the religious environment in which Jesus and his earliest followers lived. We know this with real confidence today because the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947, included Aramaic fragments of the same text, directly confirming it was genuinely in use during that era. The New Testament's letter of Jude even quotes Enoch by name, treating it as a source its original readers would recognize. And yet, by the medieval period, the complete text had effectively vanished from Western Christianity entirely, surviving nowhere except within Ethiopia's continuous Ge'ez manuscript tradition. It wasn't recovered for European scholarship until 1773, when traveler James Bruce brought Ge'ez manuscripts back from Ethiopia, the first complete copies of Enoch seen in the West in well over 1,000 years. Without Ethiopia's isolated, uninterrupted scribal tradition, an authentic piece of the religious world Jesus himself inhabited would very likely have been lost to history completely. Now, the part that actually connects back to the resurrection question I originally asked, and the genuinely fascinating fact buried underneath all the clickbait noise surrounding this topic. There exists a separate early Christian text called the Apocalypse of Peter, explicitly framed as a detailed revelation given directly by the resurrected Christ to the Apostle Peter, describing an extensive, vivid vision of heaven and hell. Early Christian sources suggest this text was treated as genuine scripture by some prominent Christian communities as early as the 2nd century, including, according to later historical references, the influential theologian Clement of Alexandria. It was eventually excluded from the New Testament as the canon solidified over the following centuries, and for most of subsequent Christian history, it survived only as scattered references inside other ancient writings, the actual text itself apparently lost. That changed in 1886 and 1887 when archaeologists excavating a Christian monk's grave at Akhmim in Egypt recovered a Greek manuscript fragment of the text, deliberately buried with the monk as a treasured possession centuries after the broader church had already stopped considering it scripture. But that Greek fragment is incomplete, focusing almost entirely on the heaven and hell imagery itself, with much of the surrounding narrative framework missing. The fuller picture only emerged in 1910, when scholars identified a considerably more complete version of the same text preserved separately within the Ethiopic manuscript tradition. This Ethiopic version includes substantial material largely absent from the Greek fragment: an opening dialogue set on the Mount of Olives, a transfiguration scene featuring Moses and Elijah, and a closing account of Christ's ascension, framing the entire vision explicitly within the broader story of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances and final teachings to his disciples before leaving the earth. It's worth being precise about exactly what this fact does and doesn't establish, because overselling it would be just as misleading as the clickbait headlines this entire topic tends to attract. The Apocalypse of Peter is not part of the New Testament in any major Christian tradition today, including within Ethiopia's own scriptural lists. And serious biblical scholars study it as an important window into early Christian thought and imagination, not as a historically verified account of events that definitely occurred. What makes it genuinely worth knowing about isn't a claim that it secretly reveals something true about the resurrection that other Gospels conceal. It's that this text shows, in remarkably vivid and specific detail, how Christians living within roughly 100 years of Jesus' life imagined the afterlife, judgment, and salvation, using theological concepts and imagery considerably more elaborate and specific than anything that made it into the four Gospels everyone already knows, and that this particular window into early Christian belief survives in its fullest known form specifically because Ethiopian scribes kept copying it faithfully for centuries after the rest of Christianity had already let the full text fade away entirely. So here's the actual fact-checked summary after running every part of the AI's original answer against real scholarship. The Ethiopian Bible's core resurrection account matches every other Christian tradition exactly. No secret alternate version exists. The 81-book Canon claim is accurate and genuinely well documented. The Book of Enoch's near-total disappearance outside Ethiopia, followed by its rediscovery in the 18th century and later confirmation by the Dead Sea Scrolls, is one of the great real preservation stories in religious history. And the Apocalypse of Peter, framed explicitly as the resurrected Christ's own revelation to Peter, survives in its fullest, most complete form specifically because of Ethiopia's isolated, unbroken scribal tradition, not because of any modern AI uncovering a hidden secret, but because patient human scribes, working in a language most of the world had forgotten, kept faithfully copying a text everyone else had already let disappear. That's not a shocking secret. It's a genuinely well-documented piece of history that deserved a far better, more honest telling than it usually gets. There's a fourth claim worth checking too, because it shows up constantly in clickbait framing of this exact topic. The idea that this entire body of preserved text was somehow hidden or suppressed by mainstream Christianity, only now being uncovered. This framing doesn't hold up particularly well either. None of this material was secretly hidden from scholars. The Book of Enoch's preservation in Ethiopia has been documented in Western academic literature since James Bruce's manuscripts arrived in Europe in 1773, more than 250 years ago. The Akhmim discovery of the Apocalypse of Peter fragment in 1886 and 1887, and the subsequent identification of the fuller Ethiopic version in 1910, were both major, widely publicized events within the field of biblical and early Christian studies at the time, covered in academic journals and referenced in scholarly editions ever since. Serious students of early Christianity and comparative religion have had access to detailed information about Ethiopia's unique biblical canon for well over a century. What's actually hidden here isn't the information itself, which has been sitting in university libraries and academic publications for generations. It's that this genuinely interesting scholarship rarely reaches a casual audience outside of specialized religious studies programs, leaving an open lane for sensationalized, fabricated retellings to fill that gap instead, often by claiming credit for uncovering something that careful, patient scholars already documented in detail a century or more ago. It's worth closing by being honest about exactly how much certainty any of this evidence actually provides, because that kind of honesty is precisely what got lost in the fabricated version of this story in the first place. None of what's covered here proves or disproves anything about whether the resurrection itself actually happened, a question of religious faith and historical interpretation that this kind of manuscript and canon history simply isn't equipped to settle one way or the other. What it does establish, with genuine, well-documented confidence, is a fascinating and historically significant story about how different Christian communities, separated by geography and centuries of independent development, ended up preserving meaningfully different collections of ancient religious literature, and how one of those communities, isolated from the doctrinal battles that shaped Western Christianity, ended up safeguarding pieces of the early Christian and Jewish literary record that would otherwise have been lost to the rest of the world entirely. That's a genuinely worthwhile thing to learn from an AI chatbot. It just needed an actual fact check to separate it from the manufactured version. Everyone else online seems determined to tell instead. It's also worth checking one more specific detail that often gets garbled in retellings: exactly how Ethiopia's own internal tradition treats the relative authority of these different texts, since the Ethiopian Bible has 81 books. It tends to get presented as if every single one carries identical scriptural weight. In reality, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church itself recognizes a distinction between what's often called a narrower canon, the core texts most consistently treated as fully authoritative across Ethiopian liturgical practice, and a broader canon, the full 81-book list that includes additional material like the Synodos collection and various Clementine writings, texts holding genuine historical and devotional significance without necessarily carrying identical scriptural status to the central canonical books. This internal distinction rarely survives translation into viral content, which tends to flatten the entire 81-book list into a single undifferentiated pile of equally weighted secret scripture, when the actual tradition itself is considerably more careful and structured than that about which texts carry which level of authority. Running this entire investigation start to finish, asking the AI, then checking each claim against actual historical and archaeological sources, ended up demonstrating something worth applying well beyond this one specific topic. Generative AI chatbots can be a genuinely useful starting point for exploring a topic like this, since they can surface real, accurately described historical facts efficiently. But they can also repeat or amplify exaggerated framing if a question is phrased in a leading or sensationalized way, which is exactly why treating any single AI-generated answer as a finished, verified conclusion, rather than as a lead worth checking against real sources, remains essential, especially on a topic this easy to sensationalize and this rich with genuine, well-documented history sitting right underneath the exaggeration.